In early 2018, my only working computer, which was a 2011 MacBook Pro, had finally failed on me. Now, this gave me a good excuse to finally build my first desktop PC. Pictured here are the different components that I bought, as well as the two monitors that I'd be using with this computer. And I don't want to get too deep into the specs, but looking at the CPU, I chose the AMD Ryzen 5 1600, and the GPU, I chose the GTX 1060. For the work that I'm doing, it was great. I've had this computer for almost 3 years now, and although I don't use it to game, anytime I need to do any of the work that I need, or for any of the tasks such as like light video editing or programming, it is held up great. At the time when I bought it was during the Bitcoin price influx, and ironically, as I record this now, Bitcoin has had its resurgence again, and so because of those two different events, graphics card prices have really skyrocketed. And so at the time with the monitors, I believe I spent $1,500. But if I would have bought it a couple months sooner, I would have saved a couple $100 on my graphics card. So it would have only been about $1,300 with the monitors included. The video started off with me trying to install the power supply unit first. This was a bigger case, and so I wasn't too concerned about getting everything to fit in. Revisiting this footage after a couple of years makes me a bit nostalgic. This was filmed at my old apartment, which my girlfriend and I really loved. And one of the things I remember about doing this build was off to the right was our living room. And as the build continued to get closer and closer to being finished, the boxes and different wrapping and everything just kept growing and growing, and it was quite surprising to see just the amount of garbage that was left over. It was about this time when the power supply finally got installed, and so I thought it'd be best to transition into working on the motherboard and installing the CPU and cooler. Luckily, when I bought the CPU, the cooler came with it for free, which was nice. And I didn't know it at the time, but the cooler had thermal paste already on it. And so I ended up wiping it off because I did something wrong. I can't remember exactly what I did, but I ended up reinstalling my thermal paste that I had bought, and so it was kind of nice that I ended up buying it. One of the regrets I do have with this build, which it hasn't been a big deal, but I don't have a Wi-Fi card or Wi-Fi capabilities built in on that board. And, you know, I've had it hooked into Ethernet this entire time, and so it hasn't really been a big deal. But there have been a couple times where I wanted to move my computer into a different room and whatnot, and it just didn't seem to work out. So in the future, if I were to build another PC, I would probably spend a little bit of extra money just to have that Wi-Fi card built in. So that way, just in those 1% of times when you might need it, it's available. I mentioned briefly in the intro that my 2011 MacBook Pro had failed on me. And if you're familiar with those models at all, you'll know that during that time, they had a recall on their GPUs where after a certain amount of time in heat, they would unsolder themselves from the motherboard. Now, I was lucky enough that the first time it happened was right before the recall had expired, and so I called Apple and had to suffer about a week or two without my computer. And then about 6 or 8 months later, the same problem popped back up. And so it was slowing down at that point, and the battery was already starting to get bad. And so I didn't feel too guilty about buying this computer. Funnily enough, after I moved into my current house, I had decided that I wanted to kind of take apart my MacBook Pro and try to resolder the GPU back onto the motherboard. I had a couple of Xcode projects from making iOS applications on that computer, and I needed to make a couple tiny edits to them before saving them onto a different hard drive and exporting them into GitHub. And luckily, I was able to make it work for the time being, and I actually have video footage of that. It's mostly time-lapse like this, and it was kind of an intimidating task, and so I'm kind of considering uploading that footage if I ever get around to it, and if I don't have anything else I want to upload at the time. But for the meantime, I'm going to try to focus more on more recent projects, because even though I have a backlog of footage, I kind of want to be driven to keep creating and building more things instead of just re-uploading a lot of the old stuff that I have. Getting the motherboard into the computer wasn't too difficult. I had a couple issues at first getting the I/O shield and everything mounted in there, but once I got it seated, the screw holes lined up and it went pretty easily. I know some people who try to mount the motherboard first, and then it creates all sorts of other issues trying to fit the CPU and the cooler in there. And luckily the GPU that I had bought is not very huge compared to some of the bigger graphics cards, and so I wasn't too concerned about getting it in there. The 1060 with 6 gigabytes GPU, I think it was the EVGA graphics card, has held up pretty good. I do get some buffering and bottlenecking occasionally, especially with some video editing, but you know, with two monitors that are running 1080p at 60 hertz, this has been more than suitable. And buying it during the cryptocurrency boom, you know, I didn't want to spend an extra $300 for a 1080 Ti or something at the time. So at the time, keeping it at a budget build and doing 99% of what I needed to do, I felt like it was the right decision. Even though the graphics card was not nearly as big as some of the ones on the market, I always am a bit surprised at how they're held in there. You typically hold it to the back shield as well as the motherboard, and it seems to hold really well. I've transported this computer a couple times and it's never had any issues staying mounted, or I've never felt like it was going to fall out. Should also mention that I didn't opt in to do any RGB lighting or anything like that. I kind of wanted it to be a clean black and white case. The case I ended up picking was a very inexpensive one, and it has a really clean look to it, and it's held up great. The last bit of hardware that I had to install was the SATA drive. I chose the 500 gigabyte SSD from Samsung, and it's been great so far. With the type of work that I've been doing, the 500 gigs has been more than enough, but I suspect as I continue to make more videos and film more things, that 500 gigabytes is going to get used up pretty quickly. Part of the reason why I wanted to upload YouTube videos was so if I ended up having to delete footage and whatnot, I wouldn't feel too bad about it, because there is some sort of digital backup to it. I do have some other cloud options, but nothing too serious yet. This SSD mounted just on top of kind of where the power supply was. I've seen some cases that have specific drives or casing for it, but this went right on top. And I will say, I think most people agree with me on this, that the most bang for your buck you can get out of building a PC is opting in to having your OS on an SSD instead of just a normal hard drive disk. The booting times as well as loading times have been significantly better than on my MacBook Pro. And it's one of those things, it's sort of like the first time that you watch HD television, you're like, how have I watched TV before this? This doesn't even compare to the old way. And as you can see, I luckily had some decently clean cable management, which I was pretty proud of. And I got the monitor so I can test the boot up. This next clip that you'll see was me playing in real time, just so you can see kind of my reaction and how excited I got when I try to boot it up. I'd say there's probably about a 25% chance that this works on the first try. So here's to nothing, I guess. Oh my God. Yes! And there you have it. That is a close-up picture of the finished build before putting the glass front on. And right there you can kind of see the other angle of the case as it finally all came together. And with the glass casing on, that's what it looks like. Now when I first mounted it in my apartment, I had a tiny desk and everything, so it was kind of a cramped setup. But more recently I moved into my house and I got a bigger desk, and so that's kind of what my current setup looks like. Obviously there's papers everywhere and things like that now, but the setup has been great so far. It's nice having all that screen real estate instead of just relying on one laptop computer screen. One other thing worth mentioning that I had forgotten to talk about up to this point was adding RAM to this rig. I obviously did that after I added the CPU and cooler on, and I put it on the first and third slots like you're supposed to. I added 16 gigabytes worth of RAM, so 2 8 gig sticks, and that has been great so far. I've thought about doubling it and getting 2 more 8 gig sticks, so I'd have 32 gigs total, but I really haven't had a need for it yet. We'll see as time goes on if I'm going to need it. I should also mention that 2 websites that are very helpful to building PCs are PC Part Builder or PCPartPicker.com and the Build a PC subreddit, where you can post and ask questions. Those 2 were really helpful. The overall build I think took maybe like an hour and a half, which is quite a long time, but I took my time, I read the manuals, and I really wanted to make sure I did it right the first time. I'd be willing to bet if I were to build a PC now, I could do it in under 40 minutes, just because I wouldn't be questioning myself at every little turn here and there. If you enjoyed this first time PC build and you're interested in seeing me take on new projects, I'd encourage you to subscribe to my channel. Also, leaving a like on this video would be great. I have a lot of things planned for the future, and I ended up buying a new mic, and so the sound quality should improve within the next couple videos. I do have a backlog of older stuff, but I think I'm going to be a bit more hesitant to keep uploading older stuff and instead focusing on some of the newer builds. There are a couple things that I want to change in my kitchen involving a spice rack, as well as adding pull-out drawers and things like that to help with storage. And so if those sort of DIY kitchen improvements sound interesting to you, kind of keep tabs on my channel, and I hope to see you in the future. Thanks for watching.